Hi there, my name is Amanda Makulec. I'm the data visualization lead at Excella and the operations director at the Data Viz Society. I'm really excited to be running us through today's session of Chart Chat. If you haven't joined us before, this is a session that is more than just chit chat, it's Chart Chat. I'm really excited to be here with my co-hosts, Steve Wexler, Andy Cotgreave, and Jeff Shaffer, who are all co-authors of the Big Book of Dashboards and experts in data visualization in many different ways. We'll be talking through a number of different topics today, but before we dive into our agenda, we also want to highlight that we have a guest with us. You'll see 5 different floating videos on your screen. Our guest today is going to be Len Kiefer. The next Chart Chat Live, just so you can put it in your calendar, is July 17th. It will be at 11 a.m. The link to register is already up and available to you, so we hope you'll choose to join us again. And featuring again our special guest, Len Kiefer. He is the Deputy Chief Economist at Freddia Mac. You can find his work on Twitter at Len Kiefer. And I'd love, Len, to just hand it over to you for a moment to introduce yourself and tell us a bit about your role in the world of data visualization.
Absolutely great. It's really exciting to be here. Love your all's work. I'm a big fan of data visualization, so happy to be here to be talking about that. My name is Len Kiefer. I work in a company called Freddia Mac, which is a company in the United States that helps supply, funding for mortgage market in the U.S. Residential housing. So help people purchase homes or get good rental housing. I work in our Chief Economist office. I'm the Deputy Chief Economist, where we try to help people understand what's going on in economy, housing, mortgage markets. That's both internally. We serve as consultants for our senior leaders in different business areas that need to economic analysis, and then we also go out and talk publicly to a number of different audiences with some of our customers, folks in the housing and real estate market, and also to the media, folks that want to understand what's going on, what's happening with mortgage rates, what's going on with home values, how is the housing market doing. We provide our perspective and try to put together thoughtful analysis around what we see happening, and data visualization is a big part of all of that effort.
Well, and I know that's a lot of really complex data, and we'll be diving in shortly to some examples of the visualizations that you've created as kind of the initial focus of our Chart Chat session today. On our agenda today, we have a couple items. So first off, talking with Len about some of his work related to all the topics that he just shared with us. Second, we'll have a conversation about transparency and trust with state governments, looking at one of the charts that was created in the state of Georgia that some of you may have seen running around on Twitter. And then finally, doing a lightning round where we're focused on a couple different topics. We'd be remiss to kick off this session and have these conversations without acknowledging all of the different protests and activities happening not just in the US, but around the world. We think it's really important to recognize the ways in which people are coming together to stand up and talk about issues of racism and injustice. And we will be having in our lightning round a conversation about what that can look like and how we as a data viz community can go ahead and actually support and help to encourage people to understand these issues more completely while still going ahead and making sure that we're visualizing data responsibly. We are going to have an after party after this session. We'll be sharing the link where you can go ahead and join us. So if you want to continue that dialogue and conversation on that topic, on the events happening today, or about anything else we're talking about today, or about data visualization writ large, the lovely Andy Cotgreave is going to be leading our after party session that will commence immediately after we finish up the formal Chart Chat. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Jeff, who knows Len well through his work, and let him go ahead and walk us through a couple of Len's great charts that he's created so we can have a bit more Chart Chat.
Great, thanks, Amanda. I've been a fan of Len's work for a long time now. Len has worked in a number of tools. He's done some stuff in the Tableau world and other tools that I'm sure he'll talk about. And I think what was interesting to me is that while all kinds of people were visualizing the COVID data, which we've talked about on our previous chart chats, the numbers of other things in our economy were also hitting record numbers, up and down. So we talked about last time, record unemployment numbers, and we've seen, record mortgage rates and things like that. And so, Len was publishing a lot of that stuff on his website, and I reached out to him to have him join. So I picked a few of his charts to talk about today. The first one that I think is very interesting to me is he's been monitoring the mortgage rates over the decades and to record lows now. So the chart, hopefully you're seeing in front of you, is one of Len's charts about mortgage rates. So I'll turn that over to Len and let you talk about that in your design.
Yeah, sure. So, my team at Freddia Mac, we run what's called a primary mortgage market survey, which is the data you see in this chart. It's a weekly average of rates in the United States. So what would a consumer looking to purchase a home, what kind of mortgage rate they see if they were going for different types of product. And the most popular product in the U.S. is a 30-year fixed mortgage. The company, Freddia's been doing this survey since 1971. I haven't been doing it quite that long, but every week we publish the statistic. It gets covered, especially in the real estate press, because mortgage rates are an important driver of how affordable housing is for home buyers. And so we publish the statistic every week. And sometimes, if you're looking at the week-to-week changes, you lose perspective on the longer term. And so this data visualization, I was really trying to get a sense of just how different the interest rate environment of the last decade has been from prior decades. You start on the left, rates were 9% in the 70s, they went up to 12% in the 80s, all the way down to the right, you can see that they were about 4% on average in the last decade. And that is just an incredibly low rate. And to provide some of that perspective and just to see that we've had this long-term trend for about 40 years where interest rates have gotten, with wiggles here and there, but successively lower week by week and year by year. And so trying to show that and to give a sense just of sort of how the distribution has shifted, and that's sort of what I was trying to go with, to try to give some perspective on that. A lot's been going on in the economy, a lot of things have changed, but that's why I've used this one, and I think it helps to bring home that point of just how low rates are today relative to what our parents or grandparents may have faced if they were out looking to be a first-time buyer in the market.
Couple design choices I love about this one, Len. I like how you did, you didn't really use an area chart up at the top, you sort of faded the colors underneath it, which really let you see the line above or below the decade average. So you've sort of used the darker colors to show whether it's above or below. And then the other one that jumped out at me was the strip plot, on the bottom on your x-axis that you added to the to the curves. I thought that was an interesting design decision there.
I think the density plots, I like them a lot. Sometimes they can be hard for folks to get. I've had people ask me, what does it mean? And it's a statistical concept, but it does, the little peaks sort of tell you sort of where the top is, and I think it's helpful if you can put it together, with the actual, the other data, the time trend. And then I try to use the color to link, so the red, links to the most recent decade, the light blue to the earlier decade, so you can kind of do that mapping in your mind and kind of see, and it kind of reinforces the point which I think the shading the top does, which is like, rates were centered around 9% in the 70s, up higher with a lot more variability up in the 80s, 81 to 90, and so you can see that in the area sort of shading at the top, but then you can also see it with the little mountains at the bottom, sort of get that spread and the sort of multiple peaks. And so I find that if you have a complex chart, if you put it with something folks are a little more familiar with, maybe with little embellishments like in this one, that can help. Whereas if I just put the density, folks that are really familiar with it might get it right away, but others might have a real hard time with that. So trying to sort of blend in something a little more complicated with something that's a little more familiar, I think it tends to be helpful, because I like to experiment on things, and sometimes they're just a little too abstract.
Sure. You did a couple other views along these lines. You got into a little bit more detail and looked at them by month here. I think Steve, maybe you want to take this one and talk about this one.
Yeah, so those who follow me know that I'm a huge fan of the highlight table as the gateway drug to data visualization. You've got numbers and you have color coding in this thing, and this kind of grabs the spreadsheet lovers. For those of you not steeped in Tableau and not familiar with the term highlight table, maybe you know this in Excel as conditional text. And it's super easy for me to see, oh, I can see certain places where, clearly new sales were really hot because it's, a bright red, and I can see, that it really cooled down in 2008, 2009, et cetera. And I guess it's starting to heat up a bit. I guess that those who also follow me know that I always have questions about color palettes, and I'm wondering, this full spectrum color, Len, I'm going to ask both questions. Have you gotten any pushback on the green and red in particular on this? And the other is, and I wish we had done more of this in the big book of dashboards, the idea of maybe putting a marginal histogram around this so I could easily compare, see which year was the smallest and biggest and which month historically has had the most sales and the least sales.
Yeah, so let's talk about color, because I do think that's important. I'm not, I think data, somebody who really loves data visualization. I know there are other folks who study this, and it's a really emerging field, and I'm a big fan of follow. And I know that color is very important, and there are a lot of conventions here. I feel okay about that in particular context because the direct number on there, so like you said, it's a table. So you wouldn't, I think, you can look up the numbers directly and see them. And the reason I chose sort of red to blue, I know it's got problems. For me, it helped with a metaphor. I think the chart I had, I was talking about things heating up. And the metaphor was, the market goes from blue, cool to hot. And for this indicator, the values were so extreme that you sort of see this giant chunk of blue just in the middle. Whereas I had some other charts to follow the same template where you get more of a seasonal pattern. Housing markets are very seasonal in the United States. Really ran May through June. So you can get that redness. It just dominated in this particular view by the extremes in both 2004 and 5, and again in 2010, 11. So I don't think by any sense this color is optimal. And I have heard people suggest other things, and I've tried a bunch of different variations. More uniform color. One thing about this, though, is I found that for audiences, when I tweet this out or I share it, this type of color palette does resonate with a lot of people. And so while it may not be the best for perceiving the differences, I think in terms of engagement, I sort of just discovered this. Maybe it's just a local optimum so maybe there's a better thing. I'm always trying to explore, so I would be happy, and I think that you could do better, but at least in the local optimum of trying to get my message out about here's what's happening in home sales and get some folks to pay attention to it and think about it, I found that to be successful.
Hey, so, Len, quick question about this. Is this data readily available? The chart is at the place that we cited before, but I'm just anticipating that people want to engage with you and they're going to love your stuff and go, oh, hey, I did a makeover of this. Probably 20 people are going to do it in real time right now. So will they be able to find the data behind this?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of the data visualizations, especially the ones I post on my website, I use publicly available data. At Freddia Mac, we have a lot of proprietary data that folks couldn't get, but these are very easy to get. This is from the U.S. Census Bureau, and I actually have a link on my website that has this exact visualization. R code, I use R to program it, but if you want to use another tool, you can find a link to the data. The data is very easy to get from the U.S. Census Bureau. They publish this every month, so you can follow that link there. And if you use R and you want to remix my R code, which I think is great, I encourage folks to try that if they're interested, because I learned from doing that, and I do it myself with others. It's all available there, so absolutely people can get it. You can try different things. They can tweak it. With abandon, and I really hope they share some with me if they do that, because I'd be really interested to see.
And I'll tell you one thing, Len. I think when Steve says people are itching to remake this, he's actually saying he's itching to remake this.
No, I'm hoping someone.
We all know, Steve. It's fine.
I'm hoping other people take the bait.
This is why Stephen is making sure his screen's not being shared right now, right? I'm wondering, Jeff, could you just hop back one slide? I just had one quick call out that I thought was curious to me is I'm so conditioned to see green is good and red is bad, even though I know we usually try to avoid that binary, that when I saw on this top chart that the highest values were green and the lowest values were red, I immediately was like, oh, is green when mortgage rates were good? And then it took me a second. I was like, no, those look terrible. So it was interesting, just kind of like the associations we have with kind of the good and bad spectrum of red and green, and how I think it was in some ways maybe not intentional or really related to the density plot at the bottom, but those kind of encodings that we have that we don't even think about in our brain that influence how we understand the visualization, I think is really interesting.
I hadn't really thought about that on this particular one, but yes, you're right. Most people would think low rates are much better than 20% rates.
Well, it goes kind of like counter to our normal of like things getting higher and better and then down and lower and worse, because we have to think about it in the opposite, that a lower mortgage rate is really what we as consumers are probably looking for, as reflected in your density plot at the bottom in terms of the frequency at which people are actually buying homes.
Yeah.
Yeah, one thing I would call out is even though the red and green here are not going to be colorblind friendly, you know, we talk about in our book about having an accommodation, and in this case, because you have a table with the numbers, you know, people won't get confused about a value that's 60 or 120. They may not be able to see it as quickly as somebody who doesn't have CVD, but at least there is an accommodation here to get the data in another way, just other than just relying on color. So I did want to point that out. I guess moving on to this one. I had an extra slide in there I meant to hide. Sorry about that. I don't know that I've ever seen a tile map inside of a tile map. So I called that one out. I thought that was worth taking a look at. This is an interesting way that you're showing a state-to-state comparison. Sort of a correlation between one state and another state. So I thought maybe you'd talk about this one.
Yeah, actually, I'd seen someone, one of my colleagues had shared with me a Tableau version of a chart just like this. So I can't claim original credit. I wouldn't for anything I do, but I saw it. And I ported mine to R, and I changed what I was doing. I think that one was migration. This one is looking at house prices. That's something that I focus on. So this was an R remix of that original, and I'm sorry I don't remember the original name. I think I just saw the picture, but if folks know it, all credit to them. But I went in and said, let's try to do this in R and try to look at something I care about a lot, which is house prices and how house prices move together. So you got this sort of stylized grid of the United States where each little grid with a label on the top corresponds to a U.S. state. And then within that, there's a little microcosm, which is that repeated, but just with colors using the Veritas scale here, right? And what that's showing is the correlation across states. And so if you look in the bottom right, you see kind of, you know, Florida, Georgia, the colors tend to be yellow, sort of in clusters, which tend to be across states, right? They tend to be nearby states or correlated with nearby states. But there are some really interesting exceptions. If you look at California, for example, its nearby neighbor Utah is not very well correlated with it, but it is highly correlated with Florida, and that's reflective of the fact that in the 2006 period and the 2008 recession, housing markets in those places, they were called the sand states commonly in housing researchers, California, Arizona, Nevada, and Florida, sometimes Michigan. Had a high correlation. So it breaks down the sort of just nearby states are correlated, and they get correlated with further out states. And you see a little bit of that with North Dakota with the energy. And so you can kind of uncover some patterns that you might not expect to see just by having, proximate, close nearby clusters of yellow and far away or purple, which means sort of low correlation. And so that was the idea. It condenses a lot of information. It's pretty hard to read at first. But I think if you sort of walk through an individual one, it gets a little bit of intuition, and then you get sort of some ideas, patterns emerge from that you might not see as easily from, a scatter plot or other visualizations.
our viewers posted a link in here. Rob Radburn was probably the one that inspired that, which was migration data.
Yeah, I remember this was entered. Rob's was entered in the IronViz, one of the IronViz competition feeders, and I remember judging this one and having this incredible sort of mental process going. I have no idea what I'm looking at. I don't know what I'm looking at. I don't know what I'm looking at, and then the synapses just unlock, and then you're like, oh my god, this is really clever, right? So this is one, again, the one you've done, Ken, as well. Len, sorry, not Ken. I've got Kevin Fleur chatting to me. You're right, Len. The one you've done as well, it is, as you say, it takes time to get to that insight, but once you unlock it in your brain, it's really good. It's really powerful.
Yeah.
Well, I think we have one more, which I'll set up in a static form here, which is the initial jobless claims that just went off the chart. We showed the New York Times front page, and a couple other newspapers did a crazy front page edition of this, and we talked about it on our previous chart chats. What I think is worth maybe talking about is your interactive version of this, your animated version, I should say. Your animated version has gotten a lot of play. So maybe I'll turn this over to Andy to talk about, because you were talking about that yesterday.
Andy, I think we can't hear you right now.
It helps if I turn mute off. Anyway, so thank you, Amanda. Here we are in this phase of visualizing numbers that are extreme, and I've had several people share this with me, going, "Look, check out data viz that I've seen." And the thing that I find remarkable about this one, and the fact that people are engaging with it, is that it doesn't have the bells and whistles and adornments that maybe I would normally see on data vizes that I like, right? It's black and white, it's grayscale, it's got an exponential, you'd be going to E numbers once the scale gets so big. So in some ways I'm like, well, it's not got that engagement aspect. And yet the animation, that big punchline at the end really grabs people in a way that maybe the stuff that us as experts sometimes don't appreciate. And I actually looped back to something you said on the temperature color palette, in that when we're building vizzes, are we building them for fellow experts in the field, or are we building them for the lay people? So I like this because it got outside the bubble.
Yeah, I think the thing, a lot of times we deal in a minutia. Economists are arguing about fractions of percents. We even give them special names, basis points. We're talking about these very, very small movements. A lot of them are statistically hard to, we spend so much time debating, like jobs numbers today, a lot of uncertainty around the statistics just because they're inherently hard to measure. But sometimes the actual data is just so striking that it sort of by itself almost makes the entire story. And I like to try animation. Sometimes I acknowledge sometimes it isn't the best. You all talked about tornado charts. I made an animated tornado chart that sort of takes the two extremes. But if you sort of look at sort of this case, I think animation actually helps really tell the story, because with an expanding scale, you just see the sort of history just flatten, in the sense that even the worst sort of peaks in history are dwarfed entirely by the most recent data, and just speaks to the real challenges the U.S. economy is facing right now. And so even though it's come down a lot, still extremely high. And I think that made the point. That really resonated with people. And
it's I've been known to criticize bar chart races in the past, and one of the main reasons I criticize them is because I have to wait 30 seconds or 2 minutes to get to the end, right? To get to the punchline. And yet that's the same problem. That's what's happening in this one. So I can't deny it engages people who aren't as close to the field as I am.
Well, the other thing that jumps out to me is on the static view of this, because of the outlier, everything else flattens down. And so you look at these numbers and you think, oh, it's pretty flat, just, not really moving all that much, except for that one point. And in reality, if that one point weren't there, we see these dramatic changes in the numbers, month by month, year by year, and it's kind of lost on us without the animation here, and the dynamic scale. If the scale were fixed, you wouldn't see that variation.
Well, and I'm curious, Len, as an economist, I've seen at least one article, it's either Financial Times or Forbes, that talked about the number of different kind of standard charts used across finance and economics that are going to be broken for a very, very long time, in the sense of when we come back to some semblance of whatever normal looks like, or bring these numbers back down. How do you see data journalists, but also just your field, managing and dealing with how to cope with this kind of spike that we're going to have for this period for decades to come as we look at trends?
Yeah, I foresee a lot of dummy variables and regressions sort of to capture these effects for these months or quarters, if it's relatively temporary. I mean, a lot of these are these right angle charts, right? Things just shooting up or shooting down, and it's not just these claims, it's a lot of statistics. And so this sort of very extreme, unprecedented in modern history, U.S. sort of shutdown of the economy to battle the pandemic is just going to create real challenges with, interpreting trends, seasonal filters, trying to sort of parse this out is going to be a real challenge. It's going to take probably years once we get on the other side to sort of see what the data is, and any analyst that's going to use this 2020 period is going to have to deal with that. My guess is that in 2040 or 50, some data, visualization people will discover, this anomaly without really tying it to the pandemic. They'll just sort of see it just as an extreme outlier, and they'll be curious what was going on then, and then they can look back on the times and make their own judgments about sort of how things were going. But that will be, I think, with us. I don't anticipate we'll see data like this. Since I'm in the housing and real estate sector, the 2010 global financial crisis was seen as such an extreme event. I was of the view then that everything would be multipliers of that, but fractional multipliers. 20% as bad as the Great Recession, 10% as bad, and now it's like 4 times, 10 times, depending on the indicator. So it's just really striking just how much that is. And from a data visualization point of view, yeah, you're going to have to either have, an indicator for some charts that points are way off the scale, or limit your time series. I think that will be an interesting challenge for how folks are going to deal with if you have sort of all these points down at the bottom and then a couple points way up here, or way down off the bottom. If you want to see what's going on, like Jeff was mentioning, that you have to sort of look at the limited time period.
Well, Len, it has been fascinating to have you join us today for Chart Chat. We hope you'll continue to hang out and maybe chime in on some of our other conversations today. With that, we're going to wrap up our section with Len and shift over to Steve, sharing a bit about this important point on the trust that we have in data, and data coming out of our state governments, both in the quality of the numbers and also how that data gets visualized. So Steve, take it away.
A few things first. Len is giving us a clinic on engendering trust. Who's doing the chart? Where is he getting the source from? If there are issues with it, he's quick to address them and be open-minded about it. And I think that's incredibly important. Also, Amanda, was thinking your question about, well, all these charts are now going to be broken. What are we going to do? I find it remarkable that, to this day, Americans can't grasp the metric system, but it looks like we're going to be forced to grasp, logarithmic scale to be able to understand some of these things. And I never thought that would happen. In any case, I know things associated with coronavirus and COVID-19 are not top of mind, but the overarching thing is a sense of trust and faith in government, and I do want to address that. Hold on a sec, and let me get this queued up and share my screen with you. So in mid-May, I think I first saw this from something that Chris Love retweeted. And Chris, it was you that I would hope would take the bait and redo the thing, by the way. And I know that you are listening. So here's what appeared. The governor of Georgia did not arrange COVID-19 data in chronological order. And I'll explain why I had that particular screen capture. And a lot of people were rightfully very upset about this, including, I discovered, drag queen and mathematician Kine, who said, graphs can lie to you. So there were a lot of people who took issue with this chart. And you'll notice it is a screen capture from a TV because this was presented in a live event. And it says it's showing the number of cases over time. And we're used to seeing time as a timeline. And they're trying to show, look, the number of cases, this is Georgia, the Georgia Department of Health. The number of cases are decreasing. But if you look more carefully and you look at what is along the sacrosanct x-axis here, I've got April 26th here. No, I have May 3rd. No, I have May 9th. No, I have April 25th. No, I have May 4th. And that they sorted this from highest to lowest, not in chronological order. And rightfully, a lot of people were upset about this because this is life and death kind of stuff going on. So here's from the New York Post, Georgia Department of Health slammed for misleading coronavirus data. And this is from the Financial Times, when axes get truly evil. Next day, Brian Kemp, governor of Georgia, apologizes after Georgia website incorrectly shows downward trend in COVID-19 infections. And then there was a press conference by Dr. Kathleen Toomey, who's the Georgia Department of Health Commissioner. And as I highlight this, Toomey said that integrity of Georgia's coronavirus data is of absolute top priority. They are working to be as transparent as possible with the data and prove the data provided to them, and to decrease the time it takes to report it. And that's reported from Fox 5 Atlanta. So this past weekend, May 30th, I decided, well, let me go to the site and see what have they done. So I encourage you to do this as well. Here's the Georgia Department of Public Health. And I start looking for things, and this is one of the first charts that I saw, which is trying to show, and it's a little difficult to parse, the green dots, which have a lot of noise in them, are actual cases over time. And understand, they may not be able to gather and record the data on a daily basis, which is why the orange dots that are connected by a line, over here, are showing the 7-day moving average. But as I was parsing this chart, I was looking, wait a minute, I'm looking at this thing on May 30th. I see a lot of the dots going down, and it looks kind of a shading that's happening over here. And realized if you look at the little footnote along the bottom over here, it says, all right, this is May 17th, and everything after May 17th is preliminary. They don't know if the numbers are right. Okay? So I'm coming into this with the knowledge that I'm not supposed to take anything at face value post May 17th. Well, now I found that same chart, which is supposed to be corrected, and where the axis, the x-axis, is in fact going from oldest to newest, as one would expect. But take a look at what's happening. They're showing me the past 15 days. There is May 17th. At no point in this chart, which I may have gone to without seeing the other chart, do they say all this data that's being shown right now is preliminary. So this is I'm not supposed to take this at face value. It looks great. It looks like cases are decreasing. So I decided, well, what data is available, data that I can probably trust, and is this accurate or not? So I went to the New York Times, which assiduously covers this and makes the data available for download. Most of it is coming from Johns Hopkins. By the way, when I did these numbers, I also went to the Tableau COVID-19 hub, and the numbers from the New York Times agree with the numbers from the Tableau hub. And this is what I ended up plotting, going back to May 1st and going through, at the time, May 30th. And at the top, I have the cases as recounted, and then I have the 7-day moving average. And it's not going down. It appears to be going up based on the data that's available. And if I do a county by county analysis of these things, doing apples to apples in this, I'm seeing that yes, in Hall County, there was a decrease, but every place else has either remained flat in Cobb County, or it is going up. So, with the exception of this May 17th, May 18th period, if you're wondering, wait a second, what's going on here? How can you have -8 cases? It's because they are adjusting for data recording of data issues, and the data is always, the way it's presented is you look at a date and it's a running sum of all the other previous dates. I'm not sure why that's reported universally in most places. So to get what today's date is, you have to take today's date, the number of cases for this day, you take the running sum of today minus the running sum of what it was yesterday. In any case, it doesn't surprise me that they're making adjustments, and maybe this data will flatten out. I haven't published this, thank goodness I didn't. My colleagues found a flaw in my 7-day moving average that I did yesterday with this, and I'm going to wait for at least 14 days to say whether, hey, the New York Times data is correct, or the stuff on the Georgia Department of Health website was misleading. The other question is, and this goes back to a 538 piece from Nate Silver in April, are coronavirus case counts even useful? Because aren't you doing more testing? And if you're doing more testing, you're going to have more cases. Shouldn't you be looking at the percentage of positives? You know, so this brings up the whole question of cases versus percentage of tests that come back positive, hospitalizations, deaths. What is it? And you know, the whole question that was placed here from 538. So one, I'm really questioning Georgia Department of Health ability to give me the cases, and I'm not even sure that's the most important thing that they should be reporting. This combined with looking at some of the other charts that they have here, which is, this isn't necessarily misleading or incorrect data, it's just very hard to parse. This color ramp that goes from light blue to dark blue and then suddenly turns red, and I'm realizing, oh, dark blue is almost as bad as red, as well as trying to look at this COVID cases by race over time. I certainly can't parse this or do anything meaningful with it. But all of this has done the opposite of what Len has accomplished, which is it has me questioning the trustworthiness of the government. And I've had discussions with colleagues about, hey, what are you going to do when there's a vaccine? And will you be in the first wave to take the vaccine? And I said, well, it depends on who's telling me that I should take the vaccine. And if it's someone like Carl Bergstrom or Andy Slavitt, and probably Amanda, you know how often I ask you questions, is this a safe thing to do? Should I be doing this? I'm probably going to ask you too. And you're probably going to say, well, here's where you can go to weigh the decision, and here's the data that's supporting whatever I have to say about it. But I'm very concerned about government's trust, because if they're going to ask me to do something or sacrifice or do something which is life or death, am I going to, in fact, do it based on what they've already shown or told me? So that's what I've got.
And Steve, I mean, the first question I ask whenever I look at any of those charts, and I think you started kind of hearkening to this, is around testing. And how many tests are being done, and because cases are such a function of testing, and we haven't seen that still being scaled up to the level that it needs to be. There's a number of different sites, I think, that are starting to try to pull that data together in single views at this point. I know the COVID exit strategy has some of that, though not at the county level. The Galois dashboard actually has information on testing by county. And I just pulled up the percent positive testing information for Hall, Georgia. And there's just this weird spike that happens on May 26th that makes me ask questions about what happened there. Did they start testing fewer people? So more positives ended up creating a higher test positivity percent. I mean, I could go down a long road on this, but looking at additional metrics to make sense of case information and understand why we see some of the noise or some of the fluctuations is critical. And I saw some great notes and some questions that were flagged in the chat around definitions. And we still have the challenge that different states are using different definitions in either including probable cases or not in their total count. You get a lower count if you only include true confirmed cases and not the probable ones, even though CDC in the US is now advising including probable cases. So those definitions and understanding what's included in a case count, we all have to be more aware of, and we have to kind of question that data and look for that information. Otherwise, I don't think we're being responsible consumers of that information.
Agreed.
Agreed. There's some great comments and questions happening on the chat actually as well. So enjoying seeing those.
Andy, are you planning on copywriting It Depends? Because I think you'd have a lot of people in the database community out for you if you did that. I mean, I think it's the answer almost all of us use once we start probing the nuances of when we make different choices.
That was entirely the point where, I mean, it came from an article I wrote 6 years ago. It's like, you know, you're an expert when the answer to every question is, it depends. I've slightly backed away from it a little bit since Jeff told me off, because he went, you know what, Andy? It depends is a good answer, but it doesn't help beginners. And he was right. So it depends is my little in-joke to those of us who are experts.
Shall we do some lightning rounds?
I think we should. So Andy, I think you're up first. I know one of the things we've been talking about here is definitions, but I think the use of text goes a lot farther than just footnotes, right?
It does indeed. Let me share my screen. Oh, I've lost you all. Right. Hang on. Let me share my screen again. We'll share that one. Can you see two newspapers?
Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
All right. So this should be quick. I talk a great deal about data being a means to convey an opinion or an argument. Basically taking Kim Reese's incredible quote about that. I'll show that at the end. And I normally back this up with charts, with lots of data and timelines and scatter plots and hundreds of data points. Here's one of the starkest ways to illustrate this opinion and argument case. Two headlines from the newspapers on Monday. They're both reporting on an article published in The Lancet over the weekend. On the right-hand side is the Daily Mail, a sort of pro-Tory government, small government supporting newspaper, saying 1 meter is actually enough for social distancing instead of so we should shrink. In the UK, they think we should shrink from 2 meters, which is our current social distance recommendation, to 1 meter because it's enough. And then on the right-hand side, you've got The Guardian, left-leaning, not supporting the Tory, a bit more conservative in terms of public safety, saying, well, if you cut back to 1 meter, you're going to double the infection risk. What? Contradictory points of view. One of them must surely be wrong. Well, if you study risk, you might be suspicious of the truth, or you might know what the truth is going to be. So both of these headlines are coming from this article in The Lancet, and in it, it says, the findings showed a reduction in risk of 82% with a physical distance of 1 meter in both healthcare and community settings. Every additional 1 meter of separation more than doubled the relative protection. So you know what? Both these headlines are absolutely true. They are both taking the same data. They're not cheating the data. They're not doing anything wrong. They're just conveying two very different opinions. So this is what Kim Reese said on a PolicyViz podcast several years ago, at least 5 or 6 years ago. And this has been a marvelous mantra for me ever since. But I mean, it does go further. Data is a language, right? Data is not truth. And what we see in this crisis in these times is that, it's not about just accepting the data that's being delivered to us. We're trying to find out meaning in this disease and this pandemic. It's down to us all to try and mandate more data literacy so we can see the headlines and actually know when we're being shown a different opinion or an argument. That was it, really. These two headlines kind of blew me away because it's so stark, the similarity. That's it. Any comments?
You're entitled to your own opinions. You're not entitled to your own facts.
I like it.
Yeah.
Well, Governor Cuomo has been saying it every other day, so.
Yeah, I like
that. It depends.
Sounds much more sophisticated than mine. What is it? What is it? You're entitled to your own opinions, but not your own facts.
Correct.
Yeah.
And there's the notion of was it Kellyanne Conway or who was it that said, oh, well, alternative facts.
I mean, Andy, to me, I think it actually segues really well into our wrap up lightning round topics, which focus on kind of the story being told and how the story gets told through data around a lot of the issues around racism and systemic oppression here in the US that I think are really resonating around the world. I know Chart Chat has been full of, I think, a lot of like darker topics lately in terms of having to probe some of these big challenges around COVID-19 data and cases and a global pandemic. And now about looking, as we're going to close out today, talking about some of these issues around racism and around the data around that and what that looks like and what our role is as a data visualization community. For context, I am a public health professional by training. That is what my background is. I have a master's in public health. And I've seen some of my colleagues get pilloried for saying, stay home, stay safe, social distance, and then also say, here are harm reduction strategies for those who are going out and protesting. And I hope people can understand that we can tread both lines and look at both issues. I mean, public health is an entire discipline designed to look at the various different ways people's health is impacted, not just by clinical care, but by various social determinants of health. And so as we go ahead and we wrap up today, I'd like to go ahead and center and talk about specifically a couple examples from this statement of solidarity that was released by Data for Black Lives. They released a statement of solidarity with Black Minnesotans that included some data specific to Minneapolis, looking at some of the issues around different access to things like housing, kind of closing back to our conversation earlier with Len. And in it, they shared a statistic that only 24% of Black people own their homes in Minneapolis compared to 74% of whites. And what that make you think about is how able are Black families to rent different homes if they're not able to buy them. And they include this map, the small multiples map, first harkening back to 2000. And looking at the neighborhoods within Minneapolis, each of these individual segments in this map is a neighborhood. Looking at these neighborhoods and identifying if the neighborhood is affordable to people of different races. So affordable being quantified as households who can afford more than 50% of the available units, or just the units in general, sorry, not available. And as they went ahead and moved forward, what struck me is that the second part of this small multiple map actually looks like this, where now there is not a single neighborhood in Minneapolis where a Black or African-American family, as of the data from 2016, which I know is a bit old, can actually go ahead and afford to rent a home, or 50% cannot afford to rent a home in that neighborhood. And to me, it speaks to the ways in which we have to think beyond some of the kind of initial metrics we might see around our Black communities and think about other issues like housing and access to housing. So as we go ahead and think about these things, what I'd like to do is kind of probe the ways in which we can use visualization responsibly to go ahead and shine a light on where there are some of these systemic issues, where are there some of these inequities and inequalities, and how we can kind of step up as a data viz community. I saw this huge rush into going ahead, and as soon as COVID data was available, to go ahead and start standing up dashboards and charts and graphs of COVID-19 case data. And as a public health person, I said, wait, this is really uncertain. This is really challenging. There's lots of messiness to this data. And there's some messiness also to data that disaggregates by race. In a lot of cases, that data is not available. And where we don't have that story, we can't do that kind of analysis. But we've already seen people in our own community stepping up and finding ways to try to amplify and tell this story in different ways. We've seen it with people like Michelle Rial, who does these small, really kind of creative visualizations with different representations of information. I'd highly encourage you to check out her Instagram and her book, trying to go ahead and connect people into what these stories look like and using the idea of a candle that's been snuffed out too early. People like Mona Chalabi, who has been creating different ways to visualize data about the response to protests and response to some of these current issues compared to the response to COVID-19. And in it, she actually uses the technique of scrolling very often. Each of these frames across the bottom is as you scroll and see just how far you have to move down the bar chart to get to more meaningful actions. And we've also seen people, especially people who are Black analysts and visualizers and designers, stepping up and creating tools to help us all find different ways that we can support Black communities in different ways. Here, a new dashboard on Black-owned restaurants, and how do you go ahead and spend your dollars and spend your money with different businesses in your own community. That's one way that we can support these communities, is with our resources, not just in the form of donations, but in the form of patronizing different businesses. So there's a clear call to action here, right? This isn't actually even a dashboard about a systemic racism issue per se. It's about where can I find a Black-owned restaurant near me here in the US. And so as we think about these things, my hope is that first, we can all be thoughtful about the fact that the big call that was made around visualizing data responsibly was not just a call for that around COVID-19. That should be a larger drumbeat that we follow as a broad data visualization community. And first, I hope we can find ways to better amplify the visualizations and listen to the voices in our Black communities. Before doing this talk, I talked to multiple colleagues. I shared some ideas on our DataViz diversity Slack channel, trying to seek feedback. And one of the pieces of feedback I got when I said, you know, I kept saying, be careful and maybe don't publish things about COVID-19 and about public health issues if you don't understand them. And their comment was, well, with this, there's a similar sense of responsibility and urgency and a need for us all to think responsibly about how we visualize data. But don't let kind of a paralysis of being afraid of being wrong stop you from trying and seeking feedback and input from people who live and experience some of these issues day by day. Think about it as you do this and as you lean in perhaps and try to go ahead and create more visualizations to expose some of these challenges and share them with your own communities, who it is that you can amplify, who already is out there, who are the people who are creating these visualizations, the organizations, the community organizers, others in the Black community, and how can you compensate them for their time and their effort and their energies, not expecting them to step up and necessarily just do this kind of education work for free. If you can't afford to pay someone to collaborate with you, that shouldn't be a reason not to go ahead and ask and seek collaboration and feedback. You can be transparent and let that person say no if they feel like they don't have the mental space or time right now. Second, think about your intentions and what your goals are in creating the visualization. This should be part of everything that we do and relates back to the fact that visualizations tell and reinforce narratives. And so we should be clear on what our goals are in creating the visualization. We should think about the design choices we're making and what that looks like. What are the photos and icons and words and images that we're using to represent these stories? And do we have the consent? And is there a certain amount of cultural appropriateness in what we are selecting and choosing? And if you have questions and if you're questioning your choices, seek feedback. And finally, what story does your visualization reinforce? I saw headlines come out as we started to see data around COVID-19 disproportionately affecting Black communities. And as we saw that, some of the headlines in the statement seemed to, in some ways, imply that it was related to biology. And that just fundamentally is not the case with COVID-19. Issues around why our Black communities were disproportionately impacted are related to access to care and systemic racism and different ways in which people actually had access to care or maybe were higher risk to start. That is not a function of biology or race. That is a function of a lot of things in our society. And so think about the stories and narratives that your visualizations are reinforcing and make sure that you're providing clear calls to action of where people can find more information to probe and learn about those ideas. If you're wondering where you can go ahead and find some of those voices to amplify, there's a great list that was compiled by Sarah Bartlett. And I've also tried to expand on some of these items and some initial starting points and ideas, but they're really just a start, and I'm just trying my best to try to help us all think a bit more about how we visualize data responsibly, but don't get fearful about thinking about this topic in meaningful ways. As we think about a lot of different things, I'll share this list on Twitter. It's already on my LinkedIn in terms of different ideas. We can talk about this more in the chart chat after party if folks want to, in terms of things to think about and what to do. I would welcome feedback, ideas, or corrections if there's something you think I'm wrong on here. And I would encourage everyone to go ahead and check out this list that was created that has a number of Black data leaders created by Sarah Bartlett, who's helping to make it easy that with one click, you can now follow over 111 members of this list and learn from them and amplify them and think about the ways in which the things that we're feeling right now and the pain we might be feeling right now are things that a lot of our colleagues have been feeling for years, if not decades. So with that, I want to go ahead and open that to any kind of quick comments, and if we want to, we can hold this conversation for our chart chat after party. And I know that Jeff has a final little slide to wrap us up with, looking at some of the ways in which people are visualizing information about the protests while still not exposing the faces and the names of people who are protesting. Anna, Jeff, if you have that slide queued up already.
Sure, I can show that. This is BuzzFeed showing data on airplanes from the FAA database, and really interesting. This is during the protests. There's a registration database that they pulled this from and plotted the flight paths of the planes, various local, state, federal, military, in the various locations where there were protests, and the flight patterns are very interesting. Minneapolis, it did city by city. There's Washington D.C. Where there's restricted airspace, and the federal planes were flying around that area. New York City, where mostly local planes. Los Angeles had local and state planes. The San Francisco area, but just some really interesting things. This was a BuzzFeed. I'll post this link as well in the chat, but thought it was a fun look at some interesting data that we're probably all interested in, but did it in sort of a light way of mapping them.
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
I think that kind of gets us into our very end of our talk time today. I know we're wrapping up. We want to make sure people have a chance to go ahead and see where they can join us for the after party, and also see a couple different resources you can find if you're looking for more information about data visualization design, workshops, recordings, and other resources, including where you can find Chart Chat, today's Chart Chat. Check out the bigbookofdashboards.com, a site led by my three co-hosts here. Len, it would be remiss if we did not thank you for your time and being part of the conversation today. It was great to dig in and hear about some of the work that you've done, about why you made some choices, which are so interesting. We also wanted to flag that you can take the Big Book of Dashboards workshop coming up online July 7th and 8th if you're interested. With that, I think we're wrapping up our chat for today. I appreciate all the thoughtful comments from my co-hosts. I always learn things from you, and I always appreciate hearing your feedback and ideas on some of these chats. We hope folks will join us over in the after party section. If you have questions, you can always reach out to any of us on Twitter or other spaces. And Len, thank you again for your time today. You were brilliant.
Thank you.
Thanks for having me. It was great.